They told her she had no rights. They told the town that silence was survival. Then a stranger walked through that door, and everything Silas Varn had built over 30 years began to crack. This is the story of Red Mesa, a town so afraid it had forgotten what it felt like to breathe. A woman sold like property in a hall full of people who knew it was wrong and said nothing, and one man who walked into that room without a plan, only a line he refused to let them cross. Watch until the end. Hit like if this story reaches you and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The handbills appeared on a Monday morning. They were nailed to the post outside Grady's dry goods store, to the hitching rail in front of the saloon, to the door of the schoolhouse itself, which struck most people as a particular kind of cruelty, though nobody said so out loud. The paper was cheap, the ink already bleeding at the edges from the overnight damp, but the words were clear enough. Clear and official-looking in the way that things stamped with a notary seal always managed to seem, regardless of whether they had any honest business being on paper at all. Notice of public disposition. Unclaimed personal property. By order of the Territorial Land Office, Carson County Division. All effects and tenancy rights associated with the late Chester Hartwell estate. To be resolved by open auction, Saturday, 2 o'clock. Civic Hall, Red Mesa. At the bottom, in slightly larger letters. Prospective bidders are encouraged to inspect the property prior to auction date. Inquiries to the office of S. Varn, Land Management. Martha Greer pulled the bill off her doorframe herself, read it twice, and went back inside without a word to the 3 women standing on the boardwalk behind her. She set the paper on her counter, smoothed the wrinkle out of it with her palm, and stood there looking at it for a long time before her husband came in from the back and asked what she was staring at. She told him. He read it. He went back into the storeroom and didn't come out for an hour. Nobody had seen Chester Hartwell in 5 weeks. That part was true. He'd ridden out toward the Eastern Canyon in mid-September, ostensibly to check on a water claim he'd been trying to register for the better part of 2 years, and he simply hadn't come back. His horse turned up 3 days later, wandering along the dry creek bed east of town with its saddle still buckled and a broken rein dragging in the dust. Chester himself had not. His daughter Lila had filed a report with the town sheriff, a man named Roy Calhoun, who had the particular look of someone who had made a permanent peace with not asking too many questions. Calhoun had written something in his ledger, told Lila he'd look into it, and apparently done nothing of the sort. That was 6 weeks ago. Lila had since gone back twice. Each time Calhoun told her these things took time. Each time she left with the feeling that something was being managed, not investigated, but managed, which was a different thing entirely. What she did not know, because nobody thought to tell her, and perhaps nobody knew quite how to say it, was that Chester Hartwell's land claim, the 40 acres he'd worked since before Lila was born, the property that the schoolhouse sat on the eastern edge of, the property where their small house stood with its garden and its leaning fence, had been quietly transferred in county records to an entity called Mesa Land Holdings, registered in the name of Silas Varn, approximately 9 days after Chester had ridden out and not returned. The handbill that appeared Monday morning was not, technically, an auction of Lila Hartwell herself. That was what the men in town told their wives when their wives brought it up at supper. It's just a property matter, a state issue, routine business. What they did not say, because saying it would have required them to do something about it, was that the property in question included the schoolhouse, which Lila lived above in 2 small rooms, and the land deed that the late Chester Hartwell had designated as his daughter's inheritance, and that without any of that, and with a father legally presumed absent and therefore unable to act as guarantor of her residence, Lila Hartwell had been reclassified in the county ledger under a provision so old and so rarely used that most people didn't know it existed, a provision that effectively reduced her status to that of a dependent without a guardian, a woman without property, a name attached to an address that no longer legally belonged to anyone she knew. In plainer language, Silas Varn had arranged for the paperwork to say that Lila Hartwell had nowhere to live, no rights to the place she was living, and no legal standing to contest it. And the auction on Saturday was his way of formalizing that arrangement in front of witnesses. Lila Hartwell was 26 years old. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way the word usually meant out here, as a kind of apology for being female. She'd grown up splitting firewood and setting fence posts and riding the canyon trails alone because her father believed that knowing how to take care of yourself was more important than knowing how to look like you needed taking care of. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's jaw and a directness in conversation that some men found unsettling, which she had long since stopped trying to soften. She'd been teaching at the Red Mesa School for 3 years. Before that, she'd taught in Harlan County. Before that, she'd spent 2 years in Prescott getting the teaching certificate that her father had saved 4 years to help pay for. She had 21 students, ranging from 6 to 15, and she knew all their names and all their family situations, and which ones came to school without breakfast and needed something from the tin she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk. She was not someone who had ever thought of herself as property. She found out about the auction the same way everyone else did. The handbill on the schoolhouse door, which she read at 6 in the morning before her students arrived, still holding her coffee, the tin mug warming her palm while the words on the page did the opposite. She read it 3 times. Then she went inside, sat down at her desk, and did not move for approximately 4 minutes, which was not a thing she was prone to doing. Then she stood up, put on her coat, and walked to Roy Calhoun's office. The sheriff was not there. His deputy, a boy of 22 named Darvis, who had the unfortunate quality of being unable to maintain eye contact under any circumstances, told her Calhoun had ridden out early on county business and wasn't expected back until Thursday. Thursday, Lila said. Yes, ma'am. The auction is Saturday. Yes, ma'am. Darvis shuffled some papers on his desk that didn't need shuffling. Are you aware that this notice refers to me as property? Darvis looked at the wall to her left. It's a land and estate matter, ma'am. I don't have jurisdiction over... I'm not land, she said. I'm a person. Darvis said nothing. The wall continued not to offer any assistance. Lila walked back to the school. She tried 3 other avenues that week. She spoke to Henry Price, who served as the closest thing Red Mesa had to a town solicitor, a function he performed imprecisely alongside his primary occupation of running the surveying office. Price listened to her carefully, looked at the copy she'd made of the handbill, and told her that the land transfer document bore the seal of the Carson County Territorial Office, which meant that challenging it would require filing a contest in the county seat, which was a 4-day ride, and that such contests typically took between 6 and 18 months to resolve. I have until Saturday, Lila said. Price took off his glasses and cleaned them with his shirt. Miss Hartwell, you understand I sympathize, but the instrument is filed. Legally, the man has standing. My father is missing, not dead, not declared dead. Missing. A presumptive declaration can be filed after 60 days of unexplained absence. Chester's been gone. 41 days. He put his glasses back on. The notice may be premature, but without a legal challenge on file, I can't tell you what recourse you have by Saturday. She asked him if he would file the challenge. He looked at the handbill again. Then he looked at the wall, which appeared to be a popular destination for people's eyes that week. Miss Hartwell, he said quietly, Silas Varn owns the building this office is in. She left. She tried Reverend Aldous, who told her he would pray for a just resolution. She tried 3 of the town's more established merchants, men who had lived in Red Mesa longer than Varn had, who had some memory of what the place looked like before his hand closed around it. 2 of them listened politely and changed the subject. The third, Marcus Greer, who ran the dry goods store with his wife, told her he was sorry, genuinely seemed to mean it, and then told her there wasn't anything he could do. What he's doing is wrong, she said. I know it, Marcus Greer said. He was a big man with a weathered face, and he had the look of someone who had said, I know it too many times in his life as a substitute for action. But wrong and stoppable aren't always the same thing around here. By Thursday night, Lila had come to understand something that she had intellectually known but had not yet felt in her bones. Red Mesa was afraid. Not of anything specific, not of one particular moment of violence or one particular threat. It was the long, diffuse fear of a town that had been slowly purchased, piece by piece, until the man doing the purchasing didn't need to threaten anyone directly because everyone understood what the consequences of inconveniencing him looked like. Debt called in, leases canceled, wells that suddenly ran dry, a horse found with a broken leg on the wrong morning, small catastrophes that couldn't be proven but could always be felt, Silas Varn had not built his control through cruelty alone. He'd built it through patience and through paperwork, and through making himself so thoroughly present in the machinery of daily life that removing him seemed structurally impossible. He was owed money by half the town. He owned the land beneath a third of its buildings. He employed, directly or indirectly, the men who carried guns. By Friday evening, Lila had stopped asking for help. She went home to the 2 rooms above the schoolhouse, sat at her table, and sorted through her father's papers, the ones she'd quietly removed from his desk the morning after he disappeared, before anything could be taken. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. She found his original land deed, handwritten in 1861, signed by a territorial commissioner whose name she didn't recognize. She found a record of the water claim he'd been trying to register. She found 3 letters from a county surveyor that she set aside to read more carefully. She found, under a loose board in the back of the closet that she'd known about since she was 9 years old, a leather pouch containing $43 and a folded note in her father's handwriting that said simply, "For the hard times, Lila Bird. You'll know when." She sat on the floor of the closet for a while with the note in her hand. Then she got up, put the money in her coat pocket, and went to bed. Saturday morning came cold and flat, the sky the color of old pewter, the kind of autumn day that felt less like a season changing and more like the land exhaling something it was tired of holding. By 1 o'clock, the civic hall was full. It was not full because people wanted to be there. It was full the way church sometimes got full during difficult times. Because not showing up felt like a statement, and in Red Mesa, statements were expensive. People came and stood together in their groups, the families from the north side of town, the men who worked the mining supply route, the women who ran the seamstress shop and the laundry, and they stood quietly, not quite looking at each other, not quite looking at the low stage at the front of the room where Silas Varn's man, a lawyer from out of county named Fletcher Dowd, had arranged his papers on a lectern. Silas Varn himself stood to the side of the stage. He was 53 years old, not particularly large, dressed in the kind of clean, pressed clothing that communicated wealth without advertising it. He had a long face and pale eyes, and the general expression of a man who found most interactions mildly boring because he already knew how they were going to end. He was not, on the surface, a frightening man. He spoke quietly. He didn't bluster. He had a way of making the most outrageous propositions sound like simple accounting, like he was merely reading aloud from a ledger that existed independently of his wishes. And if the numbers happened to favor him, well, that was just how arithmetic worked. He had 3 men positioned around the room. Lila noticed them as soon as she walked in. She noticed them because they were the only men in the room who were paying attention, who had the particular posture of people who expected to be called upon to do something. She took a position near the back left wall and stood with her hands at her sides and her jaw set and her eyes forward. A few people looked at her. A few looked away quickly. An older woman, Agnes Pryor, who ran the laundry and who had, once, about a year ago, told Lila that she had more courage than sense, met her eyes and held them for a moment. Not an encouragement, exactly. More in the way of someone confirming that they both understood what was happening and were equally helpless to stop it. Fletcher Dowd called the assembly to order at 2 o'clock precisely. He was a small man in a brown suit who had the practiced vocal authority of someone who had read legal instruments aloud in rooms like this before and found it a perfectly comfortable occupation. He cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and began to speak in the clear, measured tones of someone reciting something they'd rehearsed. By order of the Carson County Territorial Land Office, and in accordance with the provisions of the Unclaimed and Abandoned Property Act of 1868, this assembly is convened to effect the lawful disposition of the following properties and associated interests comprising the former Chester Hartwell homestead, said property having been transferred by valid instrument to Mesa Land Holdings, being the rightful claimant of record, and including all structural improvements, water rights, and associated tenancy interests thereon. The disposition of said interests shall proceed by open auction to the highest qualified bidder. "He's not dead." Lila said it from the back of the room, clearly, without raising her voice beyond what was needed. "My father is missing. There has been no declaration of death. You cannot auction an estate belonging to a living man." Every head in the room turned. Dowd looked up from his papers. He had the expression of a man who had anticipated an interruption at some point and had merely been waiting to discover its timing. "Miss Hartwell," he said, with a patience that was its own kind of condescension, "the instrument of transfer was filed by the current title holder. The question of your father's status does not affect the validity of the transfer. The transfer was filed while my father was still alive and had not been declared legally absent. Under what provision? Under the provision that the title holder of record may file a corrective claim on a disputed instrument. Miss Hartwell." He looked back at his papers. "If you have a legal challenge to present, the county office is the appropriate venue. This proceeding is illegal," she said. "You know it's illegal." Dowd did not look up again. "This proceeding will continue." Around the room, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The three men near the walls watched Lila with a quality of attention that was not hostility exactly, but that contained the potential for it the way a still pond contains cold water. Silas Varn had not moved from his position by the side of the stage. He was looking at Lila now with that same expression, the mild boredom of a man who already knew the end of the story. He did not appear threatened. He did not appear angry. He appeared, if anything, faintly tired, as though the necessity of doing all of this was an inconvenience to him personally. Dowd continued, "The opening bid for the Mesa Land Holdings tenancy rights, inclusive of the schoolhouse structure and residential annexure." The doors at the back of the hall opened, not gently. They came open the way doors open when the person pushing them through isn't thinking about whether they make noise. The left door struck the wall and bounced back, and the cold air that followed the sound had an October edge to it that hit the assembled room like a cloth across a face. The man who walked through was not a tall man, though he stood like one. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that is earned rather than inherited, with trail dust on his coat and a week of dark stubble on his jaw that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to become a beard. He wore his hat pulled low, and he hadn't bothered to take it off at the door, which immediately told most of the men in the room something about what kind of man he was. Specifically, that he was the kind who decided for himself what courtesy required. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the room, not scanning it, looking at it. The way you look at something when you're figuring out exactly what you're dealing with. His name was Jace Mercer. Most people in the room didn't know that yet, but several of the older men felt a kind of recognition that they couldn't quite place. A face they might have seen on a flyer or heard attached to a story somewhere between here and the Montana line. A man who had ridden through Beaumont 3 years back when the Calloway brothers were still operating. A man who had been in Ridgeline the winter before that, during what the newspapers had called a civil disturbance, that the locals had called something considerably less polite. A man who carried his history in the particular stillness of his posture, in the way he stood without touching the gun at his hip, but in a way that made you aware it was there. He was not, by any honest measure, a comfortable man to look at. He looked at Dowd at the lectern. He looked at Varn against the wall. He looked for a long moment at Lila Hartwell near the back, and something passed across his face that wasn't quite emotion, more like a conclusion, quickly reached. Then he walked forward through the room, and people moved aside for him without quite meaning to, the way water moves for a stone dropped into it. Dowd had paused mid-sentence. He looked at the man approaching and made a visible decision to continue. "The opening bid for the Mesa—" "What exactly," Jace Mercer said, stopping 15 feet from the stage, "are you selling?" His voice was not loud. It had the quality of something that didn't need to be loud, that had learned to carry without straining. Dowd looked at him with the expression of a man who has just identified the specific source of his previously anticipated interruption. "This is a legal proceeding, sir, and you are disrupting—" "I heard what it is. I asked what you're selling." He looked at the papers on the lectern. "Because that notice out front says you're auctioning a person." "It is a land and tenancy proceeding. It's got a woman's name on it." He turned and looked at the room. "In a list with property." The room was so quiet that the wind against the hall's single east-facing window was audible. "The associated interests," Dowd said carefully, "pertain to tenancy rights." "Her tenancy rights," Mercer said. "Her name. Her home." He looked at Varn. "You're selling a person." Silas Varn met his gaze without expression. "And who are you?" he said quietly. "Someone who walked in off the street and read your flyer," Mercer said. "You have no standing in this proceeding. Neither does anyone else you've gathered here, from what I can tell. You've got people standing around watching a woman lose her home while her father's body isn't even cold, assuming he's dead, which you haven't proven. He looked at Dowd again. Show me the death declaration. That is not a requirement under the transfer. Then show me the transfer instrument. Dowd blinked. I am not required to. You're conducting a public proceeding, Mercer said. The instrument is a public record. Show it. There was a pause. Dowd looked at Varn. Varn's expression had shifted. Not dramatically, but in the specific, controlled way that a man's expression shifts when something has entered the room that he hadn't fully accounted for. Show it, Lila Hartwell said from the back of the room. And then, slowly, unexpectedly, in the particular way that a crowd finds its collective voice once someone else has been willing to lose theirs first, several other voices said it too. Not loudly, not with any coordinated certainty, but present and unmistakable. Dowd picked up his papers and looked at them. His jaw tightened. He set them down again. One of Varn's men, the one near the right wall, a broad-shouldered man named Reese, who had been in Varn's employ for 4 years and who had been in 2 other similar proceedings in 2 other towns before this one, took a step forward. His hand moved to the side of his coat. Jace Mercer did not reach for his gun. He looked at Reese with an expression that was not a threat and not a challenge. It was simply a statement, a clear and specific statement delivered without words. I see exactly what you're doing. I want you to know that I see it. He held that gaze for 4 seconds, and then Reese stopped moving. The transfer instrument, Mercer said again, looking back at Dowd. Fletcher Dowd was not, at his core, a stupid man. He was a man who had made a particular kind of career out of being willing to handle legal instruments that required a certain flexibility of interpretation, and in 20 years of doing that, he had learned to read rooms. He could feel when a room was with him and when it was turning, and right now this room was doing something more complicated than turning. It was waking up, which was in some ways worse, because a turned room was angry and an angry room was predictable, but a room that was waking up could go in any direction. He shuffled his papers. He found the transfer document. He read from it, quickly and without expression, the provision by which a creditor holding an unresolved debt instrument could claim title to mortgaged property upon the death or declared abandonment of the registered owner. Chester Hartwell held no mortgage with Silas Varn, Lila said from the back. The debt instrument was, show her the original, Mercer said. It's on file at the county. Because it doesn't exist, Lila said. Her voice was steady and she kept it that way deliberately, the way you keep a hand steady when it wants to shake. My father owned that land outright. He bought it in 1861 and he has the original deed. I have a copy of it. That last part wasn't quite true. She had the deed itself in her coat pocket, along with the $43. She hadn't planned to say so. But something about the room, the slight shift in weight of the people around her, the way Mercer had been asking exactly the right questions, made her feel that the moment required it. The deed has been superseded, Dowd said quickly. By a fraudulent instrument, she said, dated after my father disappeared, which I believe constitutes fraud in a property matter, which I believe... She looked at Mercer, not because she knew him, not because she'd spoken to him, but because he was the only other person in this room currently speaking truth aloud, and she needed an anchor, is a criminal matter. It is, Mercer said. This is not a... Dowd started. Criminal matter? Mercer said. No, you're right. Probably not for a room like this. He looked at Varn again. Though I'd be curious what the Territorial Marshal's office thinks of a transfer instrument filed 9 days after a man went missing and before he's been legally declared anything. Something changed in Silas Varn's face. It was small and quick, and he controlled it almost immediately. But Mercer caught it. And Lila, who had been watching Varn's face since the moment she walked in, caught it too. The Territorial Marshal, Varn said, has no jurisdiction over a county land matter. He has jurisdiction over fraud, Mercer said, and over anything that happens to a man who inconveniently goes missing right before his land changes hands. The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence than had been in the room before. Heavier. The kind that settles in when a thing has been said that everyone in the room had been thinking and nobody had been willing to say. Chester Hartwell hadn't just wandered off. That was what the silence said. That was what the room, collectively, had known without knowing it for weeks. had known the way you know a smell before you identify its source. Agnes Pryor, near the left wall, put her hand over her mouth. Marcus Greer, who had told Lila 2 days ago that wrong and stoppable weren't the same thing, looked at the floor. Roy Calhoun's deputy Darvis, who had been standing near the back corner looking increasingly like he wished he were somewhere else entirely, looked at the ceiling. Reese, near the right wall, had not moved from the position he'd stopped in when Mercer looked at him. His hand was still at the side of his coat. His eyes were moving between Mercer and Varn in a way that suggested he was waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. Jace Mercer had not moved from the spot where he'd stopped. He stood with his coat open and his hands at his sides, and he looked at Silas Varn with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who had time. "You going to open the bidding?" Mercer said. "Or are we going to stand here and talk about why the deed this woman is holding doesn't match the instrument you filed?" Varn said nothing for a moment. He was recalibrating. That was visible, if you knew what to look for. The slight tightening around the eyes, the controlled breath, the private arithmetic of someone deciding how much a situation has cost them and whether the original plan is still worth executing. "The proceeding," Varn said quietly, "will continue." He looked at Dowd. Dowd looked at his papers. He cleared his throat. He began, in the careful tones of a man who has decided that pressing forward is marginally less bad than stopping now, to open the bidding. Mercer let him get 3 words out. Then he raised his hand. $12, he said. It was an absurd number, and everyone in the room knew it. The land alone was worth 400, but the point was not the number. Varn's second man, a younger gun near the front left, who went by the name Cord, and who had a particular reputation for doing things when a room was distracted, looked at Varn. Varn gave a small nod. From the other side of the room, a different voice. Fortnite. The voice belonged to one of Varn's regular associates, a rancher named Abel Percott, who owed Varn 2 years of back payments on a cattle loan and who had been brought in specifically to ensure the winning bid landed in the right hands. 15, Mercer said immediately. 50, Percott said. 51, Mercer said. Every time he spoke, it was immediate, without hesitation. He wasn't bidding because he had money. Lila had no idea if he did. He was bidding because each bid required a counterbid, and each counterbid required time, and time was something he was creating deliberately, filling the auction with air so that the machinery of it couldn't move at the pace Varn had intended. 100, Percott said. 101, Mercer said. Percott hesitated. This was not supposed to be complicated. He looked at Varn. Varn's expression had gone very still. 150, Percott said. 151, Mercer said. This isn't how an auction, Dowd started. I can bid in increments of $1 if I want, Mercer said. That's the nature of an open auction, unless you've got rules written down somewhere that say otherwise, which you're welcome to show the room. Dowd did not have rules written down somewhere that said otherwise. From the left side of the room, unexpectedly, in the voice of a man who had not spoken publicly in the Civic Hall for 3 years because the last time had cost him a supply contract, Marcus Greer said, 160. His wife Martha, standing next to him, looked at him the way you look at someone who has just done something you were afraid they were going to do, and also exactly what you hoped they would. Varn turned to look at Marcus Greer. The look held in it everything that Greer had feared and knew. The debt, the lease, the supply agreements, the long memory of a man who did not forget inconveniences. Greer met the look and did not look away. 170, said Agnes Pryor, from by the left wall. She had taken her hand from her mouth, and her voice was perfectly steady. Cord, near the front, shifted his weight. His hand had moved. Jace Mercer saw it. Don't, Mercer said quietly. Just the one word. Cord froze. I will open your coat myself, Mercer said in the exact same tone, and show this room what you're holding, and then we'll have a different kind of conversation. The room was completely silent. Cord's hand moved back. Dowd was looking at his papers without seeing them. The auction had become something else. Not a proceeding, not a legal instrument, but a test of whether the room was going to let this continue or whether something else entirely was going to happen. And the room, slowly, imperfectly, with the ragged quality of people who were frightened and doing it anyway, was answering, "You can stop this. Lila said. She wasn't talking to Dowd, she was talking to Silas Varn. You can stop it right now. You can take your papers and your men, and you can walk out of here, and whatever you think you're owed, whatever argument you have, you can make it in a county office with a judge present, the way the law requires. Varn looked at her. Or, she said, you can keep going, and we can see what this room does. The room was still. The wind hit the window again. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted against its rail, and the sound carried through the wall clearly in the stillness. Silas Varn looked at the room, at Marcus Greer, at Agnes Pryor, at the faces turned toward him. Not quite defiant, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that had not been in this room 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, or even 3 weeks ago. He looked at Jace Mercer last. Mercer hadn't moved. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hands at his sides and his expression even, and there was about him the quality of a man who genuinely did not know whether this was going to end well and was not particularly altering his behavior based on that uncertainty. "We'll take a recess," Varn said finally. The word recess was a concession dressed in the clothes of procedure, and everyone in the room understood what it was. 1 hour. He turned and walked through the side door. Dowd gathered his papers quickly. Cord and Reese moved to follow, Reese giving the room one last evaluating look before the door swung shut behind him. And for a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marcus Greer let out a breath that he appeared to have been holding for the better part of 20 minutes, and the room began to exhale around him. Leela stood at the back wall. She was trembling slightly, though she had not been aware of it until this moment. The particular aftermath of holding yourself together under pressure, when the pressure finally shifts. She pressed her hands flat against the wall behind her. Jace Mercer walked toward her through the dispersing crowd. He was not hurrying. He looked tired, actually, not from the confrontation, but in the way of someone who has been traveling for a long time and has made one more stop. He stopped a few feet from her. "You got that deed on you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "The original?" "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the side door Varn had gone through. "He's not walking away from this," he said. "You understand that. The recess is him regrouping, not retreating." "I know." He looked at her. "You're not going to run." "No," she said. "I'm not." He nodded again, as though confirming something he'd already decided. "Then we've got an hour," he said. "And there are some people in this room I want to talk to." The civic hall settled into something between a standoff and a strange, impromptu gathering. People who had been standing apart found themselves standing together, speaking in low voices, sharing what they knew and what they'd seen and what they'd been afraid to say. Marcus Greer produced the copy of a supply contract he'd been carrying in his coat for weeks, waiting for a moment that never came. Agnes Pryor described quietly and precisely what she had seen the night Chester Hartwell had ridden east. Specifically, 2 riders who had followed him at a distance, riders she'd recognized as men in Varn's hire. Darvis, the deputy, sat in a corner of the hall with his notebook open on his knee and wrote everything down. He was 22 years old and he had not done anything particularly courageous in his life. But he was writing now with the focused expression of someone who has found, unexpectedly, a thing they can actually do. Jace Mercer moved through the room quietly, asking questions, listening. He was not, Lila noticed, particularly charismatic about it. He didn't inspire people. He just asked the right questions in a way that made people realize they'd been holding answers without knowing what to do with them. She watched him and tried to figure out who he was. Not what he was. That much she'd seen. The particular kind of man who could stand still in a room full of tension and not be moved by it. Who he was, underneath it, was harder. He caught her watching him at one point. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Outside, through the hall's narrow windows, the sky had gone darker. The wind had picked up. The 1 hour Varn had announced was ticking toward its close. And somewhere in the back of Lila Hartwell's mind, behind the exhaustion and the fear and the particular clarity that comes from having been pushed far enough that you've stopped trying to find a soft place to land, she was thinking about her father's note. "You'll know when." She pressed her hand against her coat pocket, felt the outline of the folded paper through the fabric, and looked at the door. Silas Varn was going to come back through it, and when he did, they were not going to be the same room he'd left. The hour passed the way bad hours do, faster than you wanted and slower than you could stand, both at the same time. Jace Mercer used most of it talking to people he didn't know about a town he'd ridden into by accident. That part was true, and it was also the part he hadn't mentioned to Lila Hartwell, because it didn't seem like a useful thing to say while she was standing against a wall, holding her father's deed, and trying not to show how badly her hands were shaking. He'd come through Red Mesa because the road south was washed out past the canyon, and a ferryman at the crossing had told him the detour added 2 days but saved him a broken axle. He'd seen the handbill outside the hall. He'd read it twice, the same way you read something that doesn't make sense the first time because you're hoping you misunderstood it. He hadn't misunderstood it, so here he was. He stood near the east window with Marcus Greer, who had produced, in addition to the supply contract, a hand-drawn map of every property in Red Mesa that Silas Varn either owned outright or held debt instruments against. The map was not professional. It was drawn on the back of a ledger page in pencil, with corrections and crossouts and a small notation in the corner that said don't show this to anyone in handwriting that suggested Greer had been telling himself that for a long time. 14 properties, Greer said quietly. Direct ownership, plus another 9 where he holds the paper. That's 23 out of maybe 35 commercial or residential lots in the central town. Mercer looked at the map. When did it start? Gradual. First 5 years he was here, he was just a businessman. Bought the mill site. That was legitimate, far as anyone could tell. Then the drought year, 74, when everyone was short. He offered loans, fair rates, seemed like. Greer folded the map and put it back in his coat. Rates changed at renewal. Terms shifted. People couldn't meet them, he took the paper. By the time anyone understood what was happening, he owned enough of the town that fighting him meant losing your livelihood. And the sheriff, Mercer said. Greer's mouth tightened. Roy Calhoun is not a bad man. He's a scared one, which in practice comes out the same. He's back Thursday, the deputy said. Convenient timing for a Saturday auction. Mercer didn't respond to that. He was looking at the side door through which Varn had left, calculating something privately. Lila came up beside them. She'd been moving through the room herself, quietly, in the way of someone who knew these people and understood that what they needed right now wasn't encouragement so much as a witness, someone to hear what they said and take it seriously. She'd been doing that, listening to Agnes Pryor's account of the 2 riders, to the surveyor's assistant who had been present when Varn's man had filed the transfer and who had noted, uncomfortably, that the notary seal on the document was one he didn't recognize, to 2 other women who had seen things and swallowed them for months waiting for a moment when saying them might matter. The notary seal is forged, she said, coming to stand beside Mercer without preamble, or at least unregistered. Daniel Marsh, the surveyor's assistant, says it doesn't match any active commission he has on record for Carson County. Mercer looked at her. Marsh will say that publicly? He'll write it down. That's what he said. He'll write it down and sign it. She paused. He said he was sorry he hadn't done it sooner. That's something, Mercer said. It's not enough, she said. Not today. Varn's going to come back through that door with the same papers and the same men and the same plan. Writing things down doesn't stop that. No, Mercer agreed. It doesn't. She looked at him directly. Not for reassurance, but in the way of someone taking an honest measurement. What does? He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind hit the building in a gust that rattled the window in its frame. Making it cost him more to continue than to back down, he said. Today, in this room, that means keeping the auction from landing. Outbidding his man, blocking every clean move he tries to make. Making sure every person in this room sees exactly what the instrument says and exactly what it doesn't say. And after today? After today is a different problem. She held his gaze for a beat. You're not planning to stay. I wasn't planning to be here at all, he said, without apology. She nodded, once, not accepting it exactly, more like filing it away. The side door opened. Silas Varn walked back into the hall with 4 men instead of 3. The 4th was someone Mercer recognized from the Eastern Territory, a man who went by Dolan, who had done enforcement work for 3 different land interests over the past decade and who had a specific reputation for being effective in situations that required a steady hand and no particular conscience. His presence meant Varn had sent for someone during the recess, which meant Varn had a telegraph line working nearby, which meant the recess had been a tactical maneuver after all. Not regrouping. Preparing. The room felt it immediately. The air changed in the specific way it does when the number of armed men in a confined space increases. People who had been standing in the center quietly moved toward walls without quite deciding to. Mercer stayed where he was. Dowd returned to his lectern. He looked, Mercer thought, like a man who had eaten something that disagreed with him and was pretending otherwise. He arranged his papers. He did not look at the room before he began to speak. "The recess is concluded," Dowd said. "This proceeding will resume, per the terms of the public disposition notice." "The notary seal on your transfer instrument," Mercer said from the middle of the room, "doesn't match any active commission in Carson County." Dowd paused. "That is a forgery," Mercer said, "or near enough to one that the territorial office would need to rule on it, which means the instrument isn't valid, which means there's no legal basis for this proceeding." He looked at the room. "Which means anyone in this room who participates in it is participating in a fraudulent property transfer. That's not a land matter, that's a criminal one." The instrument was properly filed. "Filing a forged document is its own crime," Mercer said. "Ask your man Dowd what happens to lawyers who file forged instruments in territorial courts." Dowd's jaw worked. He said nothing. "The seal discrepancy can be verified," Lila said from the left side of the room. She had moved quietly while Varn's attention was on Mercer. "Daniel Marsh has a written statement, signed, dated this afternoon." Varn turned to look at her. His expression had developed something in it that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not quite, but its organized cousin. The cold kind of attention that a man pays to a problem that has grown beyond the dimensions he originally estimated. "Miss Hartwell," he said. His voice was still quiet. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." "You made it complicated," she said, "when you filed a fraudulent claim on my father's land." "Your father's land," he said, "was encumbered by a debt he took on 3 years ago. Witnessed and recorded." "Show the witnesses," Mercer said immediately. "The witnesses are in this room?" Mercer looked around. "Anyone here witness Chester Hartwell take on a debt to Silas Varn?" He waited. "Anyone?" The room was quiet. Abel Perkett, who had been bidding on Varn's behalf, and who was now standing near the front in the way of someone who was reconsidering the cost-benefit of his position, looked at his boots. Dolan had positioned himself near the right wall. He was watching Mercer with a specific quality of attention. Professional, calibrating. He hadn't touched the gun at his hip, but he was the kind of man who touched it slowly when he decided to, which was in some ways worse. Mercer had been aware of Dolan since the moment he walked in. He kept Dolan in his peripheral vision the way you keep a lit lantern in a barn in your peripheral vision, without staring, without looking away. Varn walked down from the stage. He moved through the room without hurry, stopping in the open space between the stage and the assembled townspeople, and he looked around at the faces with an expression that was almost reflective, as though he were reviewing an inventory. "I want to explain something," he said. He wasn't addressing Mercer. He was addressing the room. "I've been in Red Mesa for 11 years. I've put money into this town when no one else would. The mill, the road north, the water line to the East Quarter. When the bank in Carson County stopped lending after the drought, I lent. When businesses couldn't make payroll, I covered it." He paused. "I'm not a villain in a story. I'm a man who invested in a place and expects those investments to be honored." Nobody said anything for a moment, which was, Mercer knew, the intended effect. Varn was good at this, at reframing the architecture of what he'd built so that the people trapped inside it felt like beneficiaries rather than captives. "You invested in a place," Marcus Greer said, from the left wall, "and then changed the terms on everyone who borrowed from you." Varn looked at him. "Business terms adjust. You adjusted mine 3 times in 2 years. Each time I was current on payments. Each time the new rate was higher than I could reasonably meet." Greer's voice was not raised, but it had something in it, a steadiness that had apparently been accumulating somewhere for a long time. "That's not investment. That's a trap with a friendly door." A few people in the room made sounds that weren't quite words, but communicated agreement. "The Hartwell land," Agnes Pryor said, "has been in that family for 20 years. Chester Hartwell built the schoolhouse. He donated the eastern lot for it when the town had no money for land. He did that freely. She was looking at Varn with the directness of a woman who has decided that whatever comes next, she is done managing her expression around this man. And he is missing. And you filed a transfer 9 days after he went missing. And you sent for this auction before anyone even knows if he's alive. Something moved in Varn's face. It was brief and controlled. Chester Hartwell's whereabouts. 2 of your men followed him east, Agnes said. I saw them. I didn't say anything because I was afraid to. I'm saying it now. She looked at Darvis in the corner, who was still writing. Write that down. Darvis wrote it down. The room had shifted again. Not dramatically, not the way a crowd shifts when it becomes a mob, which is a different and uglier thing. More slowly, more deliberately. The way a structure shifts when enough pressure has been applied to enough of its support simultaneously. Each person who had spoken had taken on some portion of the risk that had previously kept everyone silent, and in distributing that risk, they had made it bearable. Not safe. Bearable. Varn understood this. Mercer could see him understanding it. Dolan, Varn said quietly. Dolan took a step forward from the wall. Mercer turned to face him directly. Don't. Dolan looked at him. He was not a man who was easily read, but something in the look he gave Mercer had the quality of one professional taking the measure of another, assessing range, assessing history, running the arithmetic of what a situation was worth. Whatever he's paying you, Mercer said, it's not enough for what this room is about to become. You don't know what he's paying me, Dolan said. His voice was lower than expected, unhurried. No, Mercer said, but I know what you're about to step into. And I don't think you came to Red Mesa to shoot a room full of dry goods merchants and school teachers over a land transfer that's already got a forgery problem. Dolan said nothing. Walk out, Mercer said. Right now. Take your money for the ride and leave this where it is. Because if you draw in here, this becomes something else. And whatever else it becomes, it ends your working days in the territory. Every marshal from here to the Montana line hears what happened in this room. It was a long moment. The room held its breath in the specific way of people who understood that the next 5 seconds contained the possibility of something irreversible. Dolan looked at Varn. Varn's expression gave him nothing. Dolan looked back at Mercer. Something settled in his face, not backing down exactly, more like a calculation completing. He put his hand down at his side. He walked to the main door, not the side door, and he left without looking at anyone. The door swung shut behind him. Reese and Cord were still in the room. They looked at each other, then at Varn, then at Mercer. Neither of them moved. Silas Varn stood in the middle of the room, and for the first time since Mercer had laid eyes on him, he appeared to be working without a net. The proceeding had gone sideways. His additional man had walked. The room had found something in itself that he hadn't anticipated, which meant his reading of this town had been wrong, or that the man who'd walked through those doors had changed it fast enough to matter. This isn't finished, Varn said. He looked at Lila, then at Mercer. The look he gave Mercer was the specific look of someone adding a name to a private list. The auction is finished, Mercer said. For today. For today, Varn said. Yes. He walked to the side door and through it, and Reese and Cord followed him, and Dowd gathered his papers for the second time in an hour with the look of a man who was seriously reconsidering his professional associations. When the door shut, the Civic Hall of Red Mesa sat in a silence that felt, for the first time all afternoon, like something other than fear. But it didn't last, because relief never lasts when the problem is still outside the door. People began to talk, and the talking was ragged and overlapping and full of the particular anxiety of people who had done something they couldn't undo. Marcus Greer sat down on a bench and put his face in his hands for a moment. Not crying, just breathing, and his wife stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything. Agnes Pryor asked Darvis if he was planning to do anything with what he'd written, and Darvis said he didn't know, but he was going to keep writing until somebody told him to stop. Lila found Mercer near the window again. He was looking out at the street, watching the direction Varn had gone. He'll try again, she said. Tonight, probably, Mercer said. Different approach. What approach? He turned from the window. He can't do the auction again. Not with the forgery question on the instrument. So he goes around it, sends men to the schoolhouse, tells you the property is being seized under some other provision, does it quietly, without a room full of witnesses. Lila felt the cold of that land in her stomach, the particular cold of a threat that makes sense. Then I can't go back there alone. No, he said. You can't. He said it plainly, without softening it, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated a reassurance. Where do I go? He thought for a moment. Is there anyone in this town whose building Varn doesn't own the paper on? She considered it. Agnes Pryor. She paid her deed off 4 years ago, and Varn tried to buy it after, and she refused. Ask her, he said. She looked at him. And you? He picked his hat up from where he'd set it on the window ledge. He looked at it for a moment. I'm going to find out where Varn's men sleep. That's not an answer, she said. It's the honest one, he said. He put the hat on. I told you I wasn't planning to stay. I know what you told me. He looked at her, really looked, in the way he hadn't quite in the middle of everything else happening. She held it. One night, he said finally. Let's get through one night. It was not a promise. She understood it wasn't a promise, and she appreciated that too, in the strange, exhausted way of a woman who had spent a week being told comfortable things that turned out to be nothing. One night, she said. Outside, the light was going gray and thin at the edges, and somewhere on the far side of Red Mesa, Silas Varn was walking back to his office with 11 years of careful construction suddenly requiring repairs he hadn't anticipated. And the town, this tired, frightened, imperfect town, sat in the civic hall and breathed and waited and tried to figure out what it had just become. The night passed without incident, which was its own kind of warning. Mercer knew that kind of quiet. He'd slept in enough towns to understand the difference between a place that was actually at peace and a place that was holding its breath. Red Mesa that Saturday night was the second kind. The stillness of a town that had done something unexpected and was waiting to find out what it cost. He didn't sleep much. He'd taken a room at the boarding house on the north end of town, the one run by a widow named Clara Fitch, who charged fair rates and asked no questions, which were his 2 requirements in a lodging. He lay on the narrow bed with his boots off and his gun belt on the chair beside him and stared at the ceiling and listened to the town settle into itself. Horses moving somewhere down the street around midnight. A door closing on the far side of the building. The particular silence that follows a door closing when you're listening to find out if footsteps follow it. No footsteps. He was up before first light. He'd spent part of the previous evening doing what he'd told Lila he would, finding out where Varn's men were staying. Reese and Cord were at the saloon, in the 2 rooms above it that Varn apparently kept on a permanent arrangement. That told him something. The saloon owner was in Varn's pocket, which meant the saloon was not neutral ground. He noted it and moved on. He found 2 other men he didn't recognize. Newer faces, brought in sometime in the last week, neither of them carrying themselves like cowhands. At the far end of the livery stable, in the hay room, which meant they were being kept out of sight. That told him something too. Varn was staging, not just reacting. He'd had contingency men positioned before Saturday's auction, which meant the auction going sideways hadn't caught him entirely flat-footed. He'd anticipated some resistance. He just hadn't anticipated the specific shape it took. Lila had gone to Agnes Pryor's house as Mercer had suggested. Agnes had opened her door without being asked twice, which confirmed Mercer's read of her. She was a woman who had been afraid for a long time and had apparently reached some interior threshold where fear became less manageable than action. Those people were useful when they appeared. Sunday morning, Mercer walked the length of Red Mesa's main street twice, slowly, looking at the buildings and the spaces between them and the angles of approach from the road that came in from the east. He was building a map in his head, not because he planned to fight, but because a man who understood the terrain of a place was never entirely surprised by what happened in it. He was standing outside the dry goods store, looking east, when Marcus Greer opened up at 7 and found him there. "You eaten?" Greer said. "Not yet." "Martha made biscuits. Come in." It was not a question, so Mercer didn't treat it like one. He followed Greer inside and sat at the small table near the back that the family used for meals. And Martha Greer, who was a solid woman with flour already on her hands, put a plate in front of him without ceremony. He ate without talking, which the Greers appeared to find acceptable. They were people who understood that some conversations needed to wait for the food to be finished. When he set the plate aside, Greer said, "He's going to move on the schoolhouse today." Mercer looked at him. You know that, or you're guessing. Perkett came to me last night. Abel Perkott, the man who was bidding for Varn at the auction. He's scared. The forgery business scared him. He doesn't want to be attached to a criminal proceeding. Greer folded his hands on the table. He told me Varn's plan is to send Reese and Cord to the schoolhouse this morning with a writ of possession. Sheriff's not back until Thursday. No one to contest it. A writ issued by whom? Dowd drafted it. Notarized it himself. Dowd can't notarize his own instrument, Mercer said. No, but who in Red Mesa is going to tell him that at 7 in the morning when he's got 2 armed men standing behind him? The answer to that was obvious enough that neither of them said it. Martha Greer set a cup of coffee down beside Mercer's empty plate. She did it with a deliberateness that communicated something. Not quite a challenge, more like a statement of position. Lila's at Agnes's, she said. She's not at the schoolhouse. Doesn't matter, Mercer said. If they take the schoolhouse with the writ, they've established possession. Legal fact, even with a forged instrument, until it's contested. And by the time it's contested, Varn can have the locks changed and the structure altered and the contents removed. And Lila has to fight to prove something that physically no longer exists in the form she left it. Martha looked at him. So what do? He drank his coffee. Be there first, Matt. He got to the schoolhouse at 7:40. Lila was already there. She was standing at the front door with a key in the lock and a carpet bag at her feet that contained, he guessed, the documents and the money and whatever else she considered essential. She looked like she'd slept roughly and hadn't bothered to pretend otherwise. Her hair was pulled back in the functional way of someone who did not have time for anything else, and there were shadows under her eyes that spoke to a night of lying awake running scenarios. She looked at him without surprise. Agnes told me about the writ. Greer told me too, he said. How'd Agnes know? Agnes knows everything that happens in this town, Lila said. She always has. She just stopped telling people because nobody was doing anything with what she said. He looked at the schoolhouse. It was a plain, solid structure, timber frame, well-fitted, with the schoolroom occupying the main floor and the 2 rooms above where Lila lived. The windows were intact. The door had a good lock. Chester Hartwell had built it to last, which was apparently the kind of man he'd been. You got the deed, Mercer said. I've had it since we spoke yesterday, she said, a small edge in her voice that said she didn't appreciate the question. The deed establishes your legal right to be here. If they come with a writ, you hold the deed up and you tell them the instrument is contested and you're not vacating under a fraudulent claim. He looked at her. And you don't open the door. And if they take the door off, then we have a different conversation. She looked at him steadily. Are you planning to be here for that conversation? I'm here now, he said. She unlocked the door. She went inside. After a moment, he followed her. The schoolroom was what you'd expect from a woman who took her work seriously. The desks were arranged with care. A map of the territories was pinned to the east wall. On the board at the front, still visible from Friday's lesson, were the words water cycle, and beneath them a diagram in chalk that the weekend hadn't quite erased. The room smelled of chalk dust and pine and the faint ghost of many small bodies having occupied it for multiple years, which was a smell Mercer associated with something he couldn't quite name. Lila went upstairs to her rooms. He heard her moving around up there, quick, purposeful sounds. He stayed downstairs and pulled a chair to a position where he could see the door and the 2 windows simultaneously, and he waited. They came at 8:15, not Reese and Cord as expected. Varn had sent Cord and one of the new men, the ones who'd been kept at the livery. The new man was taller than Cord, with a flat expression and work-calloused hands that didn't look like they'd come from ranch work. They came up the path without hurrying, Cord in front with a folded paper in his hand. Mercer opened the door before they knocked. Cord stopped. He looked at Mercer with an expression that worked to arrange itself into something neutral and mostly succeeded. We're here on a legal matter, he said. Got a writ of possession for this property. Let me see it, Mercer said. Cord held it out. Mercer took it. He unfolded it and read it carefully, taking his time. He was aware of the second man standing 2 steps behind Cord and of the particular way that man was holding his weight. Dowd drafted this, Mercer said. It's a legal writ, Cord said. It's signed by Dowd and notarized by Dowd. A lawyer cannot notarize his own instrument. This is invalid on its face. He folded the paper and held it back out. Tell Mr. Varn he needs a different notary. And tell him the underlying transfer instrument is being contested for a forged seal, which he already knows, which means there's no valid basis for a possession claim regardless of who notarizes the writ. Cord did not take the paper back. Miss Hartwell needs to vacate. Miss Hartwell is the legal occupant of a property whose title transfer is under challenge, Mercer said. She's not going anywhere. The second man took a step to the right, which was a small movement but a meaningful one, the beginning of a flanking position. Mercer looked at him directly. "Keep your feet still," Mercer said. The man stopped. Lila appeared at the top of the interior stairs. She looked down at Cord through the open door. "I know you, Cord," she said. "You've been in this town 2 years. You've sat in that saloon and eaten your supper like everyone else." She held up the original deed. "This land has been in my family for 20 years. What Varn is holding is a forged transfer. You can read, I assume. So can every person in this town who saw what happened yesterday." Cord's jaw was working slightly. He was not a man who was comfortable being spoken to directly by a woman standing on a staircase while a dangerous man blocked the only door. "We have instructions," Cord said. "I know you do," Lila said. "So does everyone else who does something wrong for someone who's paying them." There was no heat in her voice, which made it worse somehow. "That's never once made the thing right." Cord looked at Mercer. He made a calculation. Then he turned and walked back down the path, the second man following him. Mercer watched them go. He closed the door. From the stairs, Lila said, "They'll be back?" "Yes," he said, "with more men." Yeah, they came back at 11 o'clock. Varn came himself this time, which told Mercer everything about how the morning had gone in Varn's office, that the calculation had shifted, that waiting was now costing more than acting. He brought Reese and Cord and both of the men from the livery, and he came not to the schoolhouse but to the civic hall, which he apparently intended to use for the second time in 2 days as a stage for a formal action. He'd sent word ahead. The bell above the hall was rung twice, which in Red Mesa was the signal for a town assembly. People came out of habit, and because the bell had been rung and because by now word of Saturday had spread to every corner of the town, the version of it that traveled fast and got bigger as it moved, the way significant events do. The hall filled again. It had a different quality this time. Less dread, more agitation. People who had been sitting on fences were now actively choosing sides, or at least actively aware that a side existed to choose. Varn walked to the stage. Dowd was not with him, which was notable. He stood at the lectern without papers, without ceremony, and he looked at the assembled town with an expression that had dispensed entirely with the mild boredom of Saturday. What was in his face now was harder and more honest. The performance of reasonableness had cost too much the day before. "I've built this town," he said. Not loudly. He still didn't raise his voice. 11 years. I've put money and time and risk into this place when nobody else would. The mill employs 40 men. The road north took 4 years to finance. I've carried debts for people in this room who couldn't make payments, and I didn't call the instruments because I believed in this community." He paused. "Yesterday, a man I've never seen before walked into a legal proceeding and disrupted it based on accusations he can't prove, and some of you followed him." He let that sit for a moment. "I want you to think about that. A stranger. A man with no stake here, no history here, no investment in what happens to this town. You followed a stranger. He was good. Mercer gave him that. The argument had genuine force, not because it was true, but because it touched something real. Loyalty to place versus loyalty to a newcomer. The community versus the outsider. "The deed," Mercer said from the back of the room. He held it up, Lila's copy, which she'd handed him before they'd walked over separately. Chester Hartwell's original deed, dated 1861, signed and properly recorded. No encumbrances. No debt to Mesa Land Holdings. No debt to Silas Varn. He looked at the room. "If Varn has a counter-instrument, let's see it, the original, not a filed copy. The document itself with the signatures and the notary seal, so Daniel Marsh can tell us whether that seal belongs to a real commission." Varn looked at him across the room. "You don't have standing here." "Neither do you, apparently," Mercer said. "Show the document." "The document is on file. Show it." Varn's expression had gone somewhere past calculation into something raw. He looked at Reese, a short nod. Reese moved forward from the wall toward Lila, who was standing near the center of the room. He put his hand on her arm. "You're coming with us," Reese said. The room went electric. It was the touch that did it. The physical fact of a man's hand on Lila Hartwell's arm in a public room, in front of people who knew her, who had watched her teach their children, who had stood beside her father at community meetings. The room that had been tipping now tipped. Lila pulled her arm back. "Don't touch me." Reese held on. Mercer was already moving. He came through the crowd fast, not running, but with the focused economy of a man who has closed distances before and knows exactly how many steps it takes. He got a hand on Reese's wrist and pulled it off Lila's arm and stepped between them in a single continuous motion. "She's not going anywhere," Mercer said. Reese swung. It was a fast swing, harder than it looked coming, and it caught Mercer on the side of the jaw with enough force to knock his head sideways. He didn't go down. He took the hit and reset and hit Reese back. Once, short, with the heel of his palm, in the center of Reese's nose. Reese sat down on the floor and put both hands to his face. Cord came from the left. Mercer turned and caught his outstretched arm at the elbow and used his own momentum to redirect him sideways into the nearest bench, which gave a sharp crack under the impact. Cord went down over it, not unconscious but tangled and winded. The second liveryman had his hand on his gun. Mercer looked at him. He was breathing hard from the last 15 seconds, and his jaw was already swelling, and he looked like a man who was fully prepared to have a worse next 30 seconds than the last 15. "Pull it," Mercer said, "and there is no version of today that ends well for you. You're looking at a room full of witnesses and a man who hasn't drawn on anyone." The liveryman's hand stayed on the gun. Did not draw it. "She's not for sale," Mercer said, loud enough for the room, not breaking eye contact with the liveryman. "She's not property. She's not an estate. She is a person standing in a building on land that belongs to her family, and nobody in this room has a legal document that proves otherwise." He looked at Varn finally. "Tell your man to take his hand off that gun, Varn, because the next thing that happens determines what this room does, and you've already lost this room." Silas Varn stood at the lectern and looked at the hall. He looked at Reese, still on the floor, at Cord, pulling himself off the bench, at the liveryman frozen with his hand on an undrawn weapon. He looked at the faces of the assembled town, at Marcus Greer, who was standing with his arms crossed and his chin level, at Agnes Pryor, who looked like a woman who had arrived at some final shore and found it dry land, at Darvis in the corner, still writing, who had apparently decided that his notebook was both his function and his protection. He looked at Lila Hartwell, who was standing in the center of the room with her father's deed in her hand, and an expression that had moved past fear into something beyond it. The specific composure of someone who has gone so far through a difficult thing that they are no longer afraid of it, only committed to finishing it. Varn looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he looked at the liveryman and gave a small, tight shake of his head. The liveryman's hand came off the gun. The room exhaled. Varn stepped down from the stage. He picked up the hat he'd left on a chair near the side wall. He looked at Mercer with that same expression from Saturday, the specific, controlled look of a man adding a name to a list. But underneath it now was something that hadn't been there before. Something that, in a man with less practice at control, would have looked very much like fear. He walked out through the main doors. His men followed, Reese holding his face, Cord limping slightly, and for the second time in 2 days, the Civic Hall of Red Mesa sat in a silence that had weight to it. Not the weight of dread, but the weight of something completed, or nearly completed. Because Mercer, standing in the center of the room with his jaw aching and his heart still running fast, knew what everyone else in the room didn't quite want to admit. Varn had walked out, not broken. He'd retreated, not surrendered. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and the night was going to be longer than the day. He looked at Lila. She looked back. She didn't ask if he was all right, which he appreciated, because the answer was complicated, and they didn't have time for it. "We need to talk to Darvis," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." "Yes." She nodded. She turned toward the corner where Darvis sat with his notebook, and Mercer followed her, and around them the town began to talk in the urgent, fractured way of people who had just watched something shift and were trying to understand what the new landscape looked like. Darvis had 17 pages in his notebook by Sunday evening. He spread them on the table in Agnes Pryor's kitchen. The only space large enough and private enough that Mercer had been willing to use, and he laid them out with the careful precision of someone who understood that the value of what he'd written depended entirely on its organization. He was 22 years old, and he had spent most of his working life being underestimated, which had given him the particular habit of being more thorough than anyone expected, as a form of private insurance. Lila sat across from him. Mercer stood at the window, the same position he seemed to default to in any room, the one with sightlines to the street. Agnes made coffee and set it on the table, and then sat down herself, because it was her kitchen, and she had decided she was not going to be managed out of her own kitchen by anyone. Agnes's statement about the two writers, Darvis said, touching the relevant pages. Marcia's written account of the notary discrepancy, signed. Perkett's verbal testimony. I haven't got that in writing yet, but he said he'd sign something if it was put in front of him. He looked up. The supplier from the mill. You know Hector Fales? He came to me this afternoon, said Varn changed his contract terms twice in 14 months, and that the second change contained language that Fales didn't understand, and that turned out to mean Varn could claim the mill equipment as collateral if Fales missed a single payment by more than 10 days. Does he have the original contract? Mercer said from the window. Both versions. He kept copies because his wife told him to. She apparently didn't trust the arrangement from the beginning. Smart woman, Agnes said. Yes, ma'am. Darvis shuffled to another section of his notes. The thing I can't get is the transfer instrument itself. The original. All I have is Marcia's statement that the notary seal doesn't match any active commission, which is strong but circumstantial. If we had the original document in hand, we could prove the seal was fabricated. That document is in Varn's office, Lila said. Yes, everyone at the table understood what that meant and what it didn't mean. Varn's office occupied the ground floor of the largest building on the main street, a two-story structure that he owned outright. Cord and Reese, when they weren't being deployed, were generally within shouting distance of it. There was nothing illegal about going to Varn's office. There was nothing legal about taking anything from it. Mercer turned from the window. Who filed the transfer at the county office? Darvis checked his notes. A man named Pruitt. Works for Dowd. Rode to the county seat and filed it in person. Pruitt is still in town? Far as I know. Where does he stay? Boarding house on South End, Mrs. Elkin's place. Mercer picked up his hat. I'll talk to him. Lila looked at him. About what? About whether he knew what he was filing when he filed it. He looked back at her. A man who carries a document across 4 days of road to a county office is either fully involved or he's a messenger. If he's a messenger, he might not like finding out what he carried. And if he's fully involved, then we have a different conversation. He moved toward the door. Don't go back to the schoolhouse tonight. I know, she said. I mean it. I heard you the first time, she said, with an edge that he accepted as fair. He'd said it twice, which was once more than she needed. He left. Agnes refilled the coffee. The kitchen settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the held breath quiet of the civic hall, but the working quiet of people sitting with a problem and turning it over. He's a hard man to read, Agnes said, not disapprovingly. Yes, Lila said. You trust him? Lila thought about it honestly, which took a moment. I trust his judgment, she said. Whether that's the same thing, I don't know yet. Agnes looked at her over the rim of her cup. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. Darvis had gone back to organizing his pages. He did it quietly, in the background of their conversation, the way young men learn to do when they understand that the adults in a room are talking about something they're not meant to comment on. Pruitt was a nervous man by temperament, which was a quality that had made him a reliable functionary for Fletcher Dowd. He did what he was told precisely because the consequences of doing otherwise felt worse than the consequences of compliance. He was in his 40s, thin, with the look of a man who had spent decades making himself small enough not to attract attention. He opened the door of his boarding house room at 9 in the evening, saw Mercer, and tried to close it again. Mercer put his boot in the gap. Not aggressively, just present. I'm not going to threaten you, Mercer said. I just want to ask you something. Pruitt held the door with both hands, which was both futile and told Mercer everything he needed to know about the man's general condition. When you filed the transfer instrument at the county office, Mercer said, did you read it? A long pause. I'm a courier. I file what I'm given. That's not a yes or a no. Another pause. I read enough of it. Then you knew it was a property transfer filed before a legal declaration of absence. Pruitt said nothing. You knew Chester Hartwell wasn't dead or declared, and you filed it anyway. Mercer kept his voice even. I'm not the law. I'm not here to arrest you, but I want you to understand what you're attached to. The notary seal on that document doesn't belong to any active commission in Carson County. That means you carried and filed a forged instrument in a territorial office. That's not a land dispute. That's a criminal matter in a territorial court, where the penalties are substantially different from a county civil matter. Pruitt had gone the particular shade of pale that some men go when the thing they'd been trying not to think about is said aloud by someone else. I didn't forge anything, Pruitt said. No, you just delivered it. Mercer looked at him. Who handed you the document? Pruitt's hands tightened on the door. Dowd? Mercer said. Nothing. Varn himself? A small, involuntary movement in Pruitt's face, just a flicker, but it was there. Varn gave it to you directly, Mercer said. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Mercer straightened. A man named Darvis, deputy sheriff, has a notebook. He's been writing things down since Saturday afternoon. If you have anything to add to that notebook, it's worth doing it now, before whatever Varn does next becomes something you're also attached to. He took his boot out of the gap. Think about it. He left Pruitt in the doorway and walked back up the main street. The town was quiet. Lights in windows, horses at rails, the saloon putting yellow light out onto the dust of the road. Normal Saturday night sounds from inside it, which was strange given that it was Sunday. Varn apparently had men who needed something to occupy them regardless of the day. Mercer stopped in the street and looked at the large building that housed Varn's office. Dark, except for one window on the ground floor where a lamp was lit. He stood there for a moment, looking at that light. Then he walked on. Monday came with Roy Calhoun in it. The sheriff had not, it turned out, been on county business. He'd been at his sister's place in Ridgecroft, 2 days east, dealing with a family matter that had run longer than expected. He rode back into Red Mesa at 7 in the morning and was informed by his deputy, before he'd even unsaddled, of everything that had happened since Thursday. Darvis did it efficiently and without editorializing, which was the right approach. He set the notebook on the desk and stood across from Calhoun and let the 17 pages, now 21 pages, after Sunday's editions, speak for themselves. Calhoun read slowly. He was a man of 50 with a broad, weathered face and the build of someone who had done hard physical work for the first half of his life and administrative work for the second, and the combination had left him solid but cautious. He read every page. He went back and reread 2 of them. Then he set the notebook on the desk and sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a while. Agnes Pryor saw the riders, he said finally. Yes, sir. And she'll say so. She already has. It's on page 9. Calhoun was quiet again. He had the particular look of a man confronting the gap between what he'd known and what he'd allowed himself to understand. Those were different things, and the gap between them, Mercer suspected, had been widening in Calhoun for some time. Mercer was sitting in the corner of the sheriff's office, which he'd entered without being invited and without being asked to leave, which established a working arrangement of a sort. Calhoun had looked at him when he came in and not told him to go, which was its own kind of answer. The transfer instrument, Calhoun said. Marsh's statement about the seal. Marsh will testify, Mercer said. He said that? He said he'd sign it. Same thing, near enough. Calhoun looked at Mercer directly for the first time. Who are you? Someone who read a handbill, Mercer said. Calhoun studied him for a moment with the evaluating look of a man who had known a lot of people in his life and had developed a rough but functional instinct for which ones were telling him the most important part of the truth. He appeared to decide provisionally that Mercer fell into that category. I can't go into Varn's office, Calhoun said. Not without cause, Mercer agreed. And the forgery is probable cause for a criminal matter. If Marsh's statement establishes the seal is fraudulent, you've got grounds to examine the original instrument. Mercer leaned forward slightly. There's also a witness who can place Varn as the man who personally handed the document to the courier. That puts him in direct contact with a forged instrument, not just as a beneficiary. Calhoun looked at Darvis. Pruitt? Darvis nodded. He came in this morning, before 7, asked to add a statement. He opened the notebook to the last page and turned it so Calhoun could read it. Calhoun read it. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, but the specific expression of confirmation. The thing you knew but hadn't been able to point at suddenly acquiring a shape. He stood up. He took his hat off the hook. He looked at Mercer. "You're going to stay out of this," Calhoun said. It wasn't hostile. It was a man establishing the terms of something he was about to do in the only way he knew how to do it. What happens next happens with a badge on it, or it doesn't hold. "Understood," Mercer said. Calhoun looked at Darvis. "Bring Marsh to the office. I want his statement verbal, in front of me, on the record, and find Henry Price. I know he's afraid, but tell him I need a legal eye on this before I move." Darvis was already reaching for his hat. It took until afternoon. These things always did. Price came first.